Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This has been such an amazing event. And this room is really beautiful. Have you noticed all these bubbles floating around? I also got a rubber duck with a unicorn on it, so I was pretty excited about that. So my name is Yuna. You can find me on the internet at UNA. That's GitHub, Twitter, all the things. You can follow me. And I work at DigitalOcean. I'm a UI engineer there. I blog about CSS. I write about a lot of front-end stuff. I do design systems. I've started a couple of SaaS meetups. So it's pretty safe to say that I love CSS. Who else here loves CSS? Yes. I didn't see enough hands, though, so hopefully by the end of this presentation, all of those hands will be up. So I also want to ask you, how many of you are more visual front-end developers versus more systems developers? Raise your hand for more visual. OK, that's a few people. What about more systems design and product? Cool. So this talk, we're going to talk about both of those things in it. And I personally came from a design background. So I kind of use those things. I bring that design into my job now as a front-end developer. I bring it into my work. But as I became more and more entrenched in this world of front-end development and kind of started to go along this path of engineering, I noticed there were a lot of people that had this aversion to CSS. They would just think of CSS as this, which is not inaccurate. Or this is my other favorite one, writing CSS. And I think partially out of the frustration, this frustration of writing CSS sometimes, people have just kind of thrown it and cast it aside as not real development, or that you're not an actual engineer if you like to write CSS and HTML. And my reaction to that has been just this. I've literally made this face. This dog is my spirit animal. So this talk is about that. CSS is really dynamic, and it's exciting, and it's really, really powerful. It gives you the tools that you need to create. And you can do fun things like this. If I'm just hovering over these little SVG shapes, they can change color and mix and blend. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to talk about is just that, briefly talk about photoshopping, creating fake effects in your browser, editing these pixels live on the screen interactively with your user, and those are going to be through filters and blend modes. So just really briefly going to go through this. The background image is our demo 1 image. And you can apply these filters. With blur, what you can do is apply any unit. So you can use inches. You know that's a CSS unit. You can use ems if you want. You can use viewport height and width if you want. It really gives us a lot of options here. You can also use brightness as a filter. Brightness is interesting because it can increase your brightness or it can decrease it. So you can darken it if it's less than 1. The value that you're putting in this property is less than 1. You can darken it if your brightness is 0. If you have blank there, it's just going to be black. So it's good to know. There's also the contrast filter. So contrast here, you can increase contrast. You can also decrease contrast, again, if it's less than 1. So again, if you're at 0.5, you're decreasing it to 50%. If you're at 0, then you're at 50% gray versus the brightness, which gives you black. If I set this to 1, you can also combine these things. So if I increase the contrast to 1.3, I can just have a space separated with grayscale, and now I'm applying grayscale value to this. So grayscale at 1 is fully grayscale, and anything below that will be just a blend of things. Hue rotate is one of my favorite filters because you can just really play with this and apply different values and just see how that blends on your screen here. You can apply negative values, and then you can animate these and get some really interesting effects that way. There's also filter invert, which inverts your image as you expect. And then at 0.5, we're seeing that 50% gray again on our image. So invert, you can do some interesting things, and especially effects where you're mixing and blending with invert, you can apply some interesting effects that way. There's opacity as well. And some people ask, why do we have opacity in our CSS filters when you have it as just its own property? And the reason why is because these filters came from SVG filters. All of these CSS filters are optimized by browsers that were based on SVG filter properties. And that's where we get Sepia. Sepia uses something that's called a matrix inside of SVG to apply these transformations and make it look like one of those old filtered images. And then finally, there's saturate, which you could increase saturation. You can also create grayscale with saturate because you can decrease saturation. But it just creates this really crazy if I keep going with it. I don't even know what's happening on the screen right now. But there's a talk later about how we're rendering on the page, so we're going to be learning more about how these blend modes and filters affect our page that way. So check that out in day 3 with Martin. But these are even more powerful when we apply blend modes on top of them. We have a variety of options here. Maybe the most popular is multiply. I'm applying these blend modes to that top layer, the yellow on this screen. So what this is doing is it's multiplying the luminosity value. The luminosity is the brightness and darkness value of those images. So it's kind of like taking two transparencies, laying them on top of each other, and shining light through it. Screen is doing the opposite of that. It's doing the inverse of multiply. So what that means is in pixel world, it's taking the inverse, subtracting that value from 1, and then it's taking the inverse of the background layer's luminosity as well, and then subtracting that, multiplying those, and then inverting that again, so subtracting that from 1 again. That's kind of how you get the algorithm of screen that we see in our browsers. There's also lighten and darken, which work a little bit differently. Now with yellow, you're not going to see much of a difference, but if I change this to something like light green, then you will see the difference there. We're creating these new values in those darker areas, in those blueberries. Because what lighten is doing is it's not just taking the luminosity, but it's taking those RGB values, the red, green, and blue. It's comparing those, and it's seeing which one is lighter of those two, which one is closer to the value of white or black with darken. And then with darken, you can see same thing, works a little bit differently than multiply because it has those new values that are being created in the images. The next few are kind of a set. There's hue, saturation, luminosity, and color. What hue is doing is it's retaining just the hue value. If you think of a color wheel, it's just taking the hue, not the saturation, not the amount of pigmentation, but just the actual hue value, and it's blending that with the image behind it. Saturation is going to be taking just the saturation value. It doesn't matter what the color is. Really, here, it doesn't matter what the hue is or what the luminosity is, just the saturation. So with this light green, we're losing a lot of the brightness of the image behind it. But if I change it to something like yellow, then it'll increase that saturation a lot. So you can see those differences there. The next one is this luminosity value, and this just becomes really grayed out because this is taking the dark and light value, which here is a very gray, like close to 50% gray that we're mixing here. And then there's color. And color is interesting because it combines two of these. It combines the hue and the saturation value of the image on top to the image behind it. So the image behind it could be black and white, and it won't make a difference even if it's colored and you're using this blend mode on top. So blend modes become even more powerful when you combine them with gradients, because gradients allow you to apply multiple planes of color to any single div. So here what I can do is I can add like a linear gradient and say that I want that to be from blue to red. Then I've applied this on the page. We're dynamically generating these things. Once you know the gradient syntax, like you can make this have a degree angle, like really play with it and make it interesting. And this can apply some interesting effects as well. There's also soft light and hard light. These are two more with different algorithms that we can show. And then there's difference and exclusion. So difference looks like this. I think once we start to play with this, it really does make it interesting. Like here we can add like an invert filter, right? So I can add an invert of like 0.8 and just really play on the screen and see what happens. These are all things that the user can interact with. So there's difference, and then there's exclusion, which the difference between that is that similar values with difference will turn black, versus exclusion, they turn gray, so it's much more subtle. It makes like a more faded effect on the screen. And it allows you to just really play and interact and see what your images look like through this. And cascading styles allow us to propagate this through all of the images. You can also, do things like stripes. So we can use repeating linear gradient, which is fun. So what we would do is we'd start at blue and say we want to make this like 100 pixels. So we go from blue to blue at 100 pixels. And then we want to have red next. So the red stripe will start at 100 pixels because we want it to start at that point. And then we want it to go to, say, 200. So that's going to be the difference between this last value and the one before it is going to be the size of these stripes. So now we have stripes on the page. You can just dynamically play with this kind of stuff and change it. And it's just allowing you to really get creative. But these filters and blend modes are also really practical. You can use them when you have hover states. You can use the blur to blur out passwords or information that you're not trying to show at any given time. You can also use them for visual regression testing. A little while ago, I made a project called Diffie, and Diffie takes two different inputs. It applies them on top of each other, And you can see that we have the visual diff of the two inputs that we've shown here just because it's using a difference blend mode. It's just doing one line of code to use that visual regression testing, and it works locally. You can play with that there. So this becomes even more powerful when you apply it to those iframes or to videos or images. You can really do a lot of different things here. So if I wanted to do an image, say that I have this image which appears at glitch.gif. Now I have a glitch, and it looks really crazy with exclusion, but if I make it color, it's a little bit more subtle. And you kind of get the idea here. You can really play. You can apply like video, and video will save you a lot of time and speed for your users versus using a GIF like I did here. But it really gives you a lot of control. I also did a project called CSSgram where I did all these different Instagram filters just by using these techniques, blend modes and filters, and they have different effects when you hover them and such. And so it just shows you that if you have an output, you can create that output through these inputs of blend modes and filters. So that was kind of for the visual designers in the room, the people who like doing more of the visually creative stuff. And this next one is for the engineer nerds that I know and love and am. So who here knew that CSS was Turing Complete? Yeah, a couple of you. Does anybody know why it's Turing Complete? Except for the answer that's on the screen. So according to the definition of Turing Complete, a Turing Complete system means a system in which a program can be written that will find a solution to any computational problem. And in CSS, we have found the answer to the Rule 110 automata. And what that is it's similar to Conway's Game of Life. It's a cellular automation. And so it's dependent on its neighbors. There's some rules there that go into that. And it also is randomized. It gives us a different answer each time. So here's an answer that somebody created. This is Miriam Nadler. She created this in Sass using the random function and a few different checks here with like you're using these checkboxes to sort of check between each other. And if I refresh, it'll create a new cellular automata for us. It takes a long time to load, but if I have internet, it will eventually load. But people have done this in Sass. People have also done this in CSS, but you have to manually go through and tab through all the checkboxes as you go. But evidence and proof that Sass is Turing Complete. And when people say that CSS is not a real programming language, you can say, technically, it is. Well, actually, it is. So you now have the tools. And there are a few examples of this on the web, too. So the next one I want to talk about are actual UI components. For the next few demos that I'm going to show here, these are all components that we see commonly in websites that we create today. And they're all from a demo site that I made called youmightnotneedjs.com. So those are just some common UI components that you can build with CSS alone, no JavaScript. And the first one is the accordion. So an accordion is some bit of information that we see frequently. You could have multiple accordion bits open. You could have just one open to get the information inside of it. And the way that we're doing this is by using a series of inputs, labels, and sections. Like this right here is what we're doing. Each of those accordion top areas is an input, and they have labels and the sections. And then when we have those all next to each other, they're not within each other. They're next to each other visually in the HTML code, semantically in the HTML code. We can use the adjacent sibling selector to target them. So what that looks like is this little squiggly. So what we can say is when you have clicked one of those checkboxes, when you have that checked, then the adjacent sibling, so the section that's next to it, is going to get a height of 200 pixels. We can also set it to auto, but you're not going to get that smooth transition if you do auto. And that's kind of how we're doing this. We're using checkboxes, so we can have multiple of them open at a time. Now, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, don't animate height. That's not good for your browser. Yes, that is true. In this case, we have to do that, but we do have a property that we can use called the will change property that allows us to tell the browser that this item, this element is going to be animated, it's going to change. And that allows the browser to composite that and improve the rendering performance for our users. So you can use will change. The support is pretty good. I think it's not fully supported in Internet Explorer, but it is a progressive enhancement. It's not going to break your code, so you should be including this anyway. So we've got that. The next one I want to talk about is the tab group. Tab groups are another element that we see pretty commonly. And this one I can use my arrow keys to kind of tab through. You can see the information inside of it when you're tabbing through. And it's similar to the last one, but instead of using those checkboxes here, we're using these radio buttons because we only want one of these ever open at a time. We're also using z-index to create the sections that are appearing above each other to make those visible above all other sections. And then there are some other things here, like styling this tab so that we're not seeing the little radio button circle. We're using clip for that. And then just positioning it and applying a design to the label so that when you're hovering, when you're clicking, we have a focus state. Keeping the focus state is an important thing to do. But again, it's using that adjacent sibling selector for the content, here the content, with the radio button to make it visible. It's also applying it to the label. So you can chain these things here. And you can say that the label is also going to get a z-index of 1, so it's on top of the other labels physically, like tabs can be, like those file folder tabs, and then also the content that's inside of it. The next one is this Lightbox. Do you all remember the days of the jQuery Lightboxes? And there was articles that were 10 jQuery Lightboxes for your site, and also carousels. I remember those days. Well, you can do this without JavaScript too, just completely in CSS and HTML. And it's, I think, relatively clever. What we're doing here is we have 2 links. We have the thumbnail image, that's this, as an internal link to the big Lightbox image that we're going to be styling later. So that big Lightbox image then gets focused when you click on the thumbnail that correlates to it. So when we click on that thumbnail, we're then using this target selector to style the larger image with the display. We can actually use this to target and be in a different active state within the same page when you're clicking it. So it's just using these anchor links to create this focus on an internal link on our page, and then we can style that with target. So I think that's a pretty little clever CSS trick hack to do. And the next one I want to talk about is the modal. So here you can click this open, you can tab it closed, you can get the information that's inside of it. These are things that we see all the time. Modals have advertisements or forms or other sort of information. And this uses a similar technique of that target modal, using it on the dialog here. And it's using that target to show a visibility. We have that X that we can close out of. It shows the opacity, visibility appears in our page. But I want to take a moment here to pause and talk about accessibility. I want to remind you that these are still a bunch of hacks, and none of them are completely WCAG compliant. While some of them, are screen readable in ways, some of them you can use the keyboard to navigate, none of them are completely compliant. And what I mean by that is, in this example, there's no way to trap focus programmatically in this modal. And that becomes important because in this example, we have content, we have text. If you don't need to give context to an image that you're using as a lightbox, then it's fine. But if you need to use the content inside of these modals, these items, these elements on your page, then you have got to think about accessibility. The second thing that makes this not accessible is, while we can use the keyboard, tab and close this, we can't use the escape key to close it. And using the escape key to close out of any interaction, any modal, any kind of thing like that, is a part of the WCAG requirements for accessibility. So if you didn't know that, check your apps and make sure that you're following that. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a link to a quick reference and also some Chrome extensions that you can use to test for accessibility, but it becomes really important. I kind of trapped you into this talk by thinking oh, this is about cool CSS tricks, and now I'm talking about accessibility and performance, but that becomes really important. These are fun for prototyping, they're fun to know about, these selectors, but just keep that in mind when you're building. All right, so the next one is technically, in a way, accessible. So these are tooltips. Tooltips let you hover through different elements and get more information on them. You can tab through these too, once I'm inside of here, to get the information that's on them. And the way that we're doing this is by using data attributes and passing those data attributes into the CSS to then create the tooltip on our screen. So this example is just using a span with a class of tooltip. This is the data that you're going to be presenting when you hover over that piece of content, that span on your paragraph. And then here we're using a tab index of 0, which allows you to focus on that span element that's not usually a focusable element, like a button. And that lets you have that tab interaction. And then just the tooltip text. That's it. Class, data attribute, tab index. Also, a tip about accessibility is don't have the tab index be greater than 0, because then you're affecting how your user interacts with your page, and that could be bad. They know how to interact with your page. Don't force them to interact in a certain way. But having it be 0 just lets it be tab navigable in the flow of your UI. So then in the CSS, what we can do is we can grab that data attribute, that data tip, and use it as our content. In the before pseudo element, we're applying that content, and we're letting it spit back out on the page. And as far as I know right now, this can also get tricky with accessibility because most screen readers can read this, some won't, and then some might have set preferences to not read this. So you can't really test that, but you could get this content on the screen. The other thing that we're doing is using the after pseudo element here, and that's just to create this triangle. The triangles that we see on these pages can be done with just a couple of lines of code. They're created as borders on any CSS element. So we can just use different colors for different borders. So if you imagine a div, then you can have like a pink border, transparent, 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 and then you just have like a line on top. Now, if you take that div and you shrink it so there's no size inside of it, what's left is a triangle. And then you can also change the border widths to affect the dynamics and the shape of that triangle. So that's kind of how we can create the CSS triangles in one like pseudo element or one div. They're done with borders. So yeah, we're just applying the C index, and then we have these tooltips that we can use with just CSS and HTML. So the next one is like truly a hack, but I think it's like fun and it's unique, and it allows you to read the place we are on the page. So if you've ever gone to a site that shows you your scroll indicator, like how far along you are on the page, we can do this without JavaScript. We don't have to get scroll top. We don't have to get any other information. We can just do this with CSS and HTML. And we showed an example of this earlier. I'm curious if any of you see what's happening here. On the body, we just have the body. We're applying it as a pseudo element before here. But does anybody see what's going on? I'll give you a hint. It's using a gradient. OK, I'll give you another hint. I'll inspect source and show you. This is going to look crazy because it's inside of a code pen. But here's the body of this pen here. And if I inspect this, let me just get on this, like a paragraph here. Oh, so many paragraphs. So the thing is, it also has to be bigger than the 100 VH to sort of show this. But let me see. Maybe I'm outside of it here. All right, so basically what's happening here is this little bit, since it's on that body, it is just taking the height of the page and applying it as a gradient that's going from, like when we showed the radial stripes, it's just having the change in between. So when you scroll, if you can imagine, this is just a triangle that looks like this on the entire page that's filling up the scroll bar with data. That's just like a visual gradient that's being shown here from pink to gray. And it knows how far we are on the page because the entire size of it has appeared and showed us like exactly where it is. So it's just showing 6 pixels of that. But if that thing was gone, you would just see a triangle on the page. So this is like a fun hack, but also it's going to kill performance on mobile. It's going to drain your battery. I can't like access that little bit right now, but there's a code pen that you can edit this, and I'm going to share the slide. It's a really funny hack, so check that out. It's just using gradients in UI in unique ways. The next one is feature detection in CSS. So this is really powerful because we can use some of the newer CSS properties like grid with feature detection right now today. You can use @supports to check in your browser, in your CSS specifically, if this is supported or not, and then send your fallback if it's not supported. CSS Grid is really cool. It's one of the things I'm most excited about in terms of CSS these days. It's super dynamic. It allows us to just change things, use auto flow properties. And another thing is you can just change this grid as well. So if I can grab this in this grid area, you can see that my grid template just appears on the screen. And if I want to just like make this sidebar take up the entire side of the section, I can do that dynamically in the browser just with CSS Grid. It's so exciting. I just think it's great. Sorry, I'm a huge nerd about this kind of stuff. Anyway, so that's really cool. And then you can also use these grid areas that I was showing here. So like I'm using head for the grid area of header. I can visually see it. I think you should use emoji here because you can see it. It's one line of one unit of code, so you can get a visual representation of what this grid is going to look like, and then have it be shown next to it in the browser. So also what grid allows us to do is use grid gap, which is, this is going to break now because I was showing it earlier, but if I refresh this page, woo, if I refresh this, then I can show grid gap. Ooh, OK, I'll do it up here. So grid gap allows us to have just the spaces between the grid have area there. You don't have to use any hacks. You don't have to use any after pseudo elements or before or like last child or anything. It's just the space between those elements. I don't know why it's taken us so long in CSS to make this possible, but it's finally here. So CSS Grid is just like, oh. And I find it easier even to design things with Grid and then use Flexbox to create a fallback after I've designed it in Grid. So use supports and use Grid today. So not only can you live code these responsive layouts in CSS using these techniques, but you can create like entire presentation frameworks. This entire presentation doesn't use any JavaScript except for the CodePen embeds, but you can also do that with CSS and HTML if I wanted to take the time. But you can just create entire portfolios and sites and presentations. So this presentation does things that I think are pretty cool. The two cool things are keyboard navigation. So like anchor links inside of web pages, you can use your keyboard and apply access keys to the different pages. So on Mac, it's Alt-Control. You can just slide through all of the items in this presentation by using just your keyboard. So it makes it feel like more of a real presentation. And that definitely depends on the browser and also the system that you're using for what those access key controls are. The other thing, I get this question all the time, and the question is, how do you do the live coding in your presentations? And it's so much simpler than you think. It is just a style block with content editable applied to it, like an actual style block. So what this allows me to do is like edit the page. I could say like color red. I can give it my favorite font family, fantasy font family. But then I can also just edit these in themselves, do a little bit of like style inception. You can edit the style block. And I've already applied some styling editing on this. But if I wanted to give it like a background of yellow, I have to add important because I've already set it to white. But as an example, if I go back to the other slides, like here, it all propagates because CSS is cascading. It applies to all of the elements I have on my page that have that style block. So with that in mind, I think what's even cooler is that you can make CSS games entirely out of HTML and CSS. These are two that I created. Here I can get these targets, and it actually counts how many I've hit. I only hit one there. If I play this again and like really focus also while I'm talking to you, ooh, I got 2, yay. But we can use counter increment in CSS, which is originally intended for outlines, to count up the number of targets that we hit. I just did an entire talk where I live coded a CSS game by using some of these properties. So then you can also use the animation delay to create the stopper. You can use pointer events to make sure that I can't click once I've already clicked there. And I'm going to go back to my presentation. You can also do things like this tic-tac-toe game. And what this is doing is it's using different animations, z-index, to switch between the X's and O's. And behind the scenes here, if you look at the SAS, we are checking for the checkboxes to be in a specific arrangement of order. These are all the cases here. It's like punch card programming. I saw a really good talk a little while ago about email, like HTML emails and coding for emails. And they just used these kinds of techniques to check for all the possible combinations and apply them. So while this is a little bit crazy, you might not be using this in production, it is interesting and fun that you can create these really dynamic, really powerful programs in CSS. So if you have a coding interview and they ask you to make tic-tac-toe in JavaScript, you could say, I can make it in CSS. They'll be really impressed, maybe not. So I kind of want to leave you with this. Here's just an example. My friend Mandy made this really cool text effect in CSS, and you can use those hue rotates to just create an animation and apply it in like 5 lines of code. Because CSS is really awesome. It's exciting. It's great for prototyping. It's great for design systems. It's great for making the web more beautiful. It's great for experimentation in your browser. It's great for making your life easier. It's really powerful, but know that with great power comes great responsibility. I think that the most powerful part of CSS is as a connection. It's a connecting tool. The real power of CSS is that it creates this common language for designers and developers to speak from. It creates empathy. And this makes the product lifecycle much easier. Having that prototype, having a basic understanding, having your visual in the browser of what this could look like. And it's also just really fun to play with sometimes. And we need more of that in this world. So remember, before releasing anything to production, these are not the best solutions for all the production builds that you're making. You have to consider the WCAG guidelines. You should test for accessibility. You should test for performance. And you should definitely be cross-browser testing as well. And then use supports if you want to use features but have fallbacks. But also have fun with the web. So thank you for listening. A lot of these items are going to be things that you may want to dive more into. These resources are all going to be online. You can find my slides on CodePen just to kind of show that there's no JavaScript in this. I threw it all into a CodePen, just HTML and CSS, and you can find it at unit.im/powerofcss. Yeah, and thank you so much for having me.